Okay, Matt introduced me very nicely, but I wanted to add one thing to that, which is that one of the most interesting aspects of my work is that I get to interact with people in different disciplines and different domains. I do clinical supervision for addictions agencies, but I also work with cultural institutions, schools, corporations, governments, and I get to see a really broad swath of approaches to these interconnected themes of mental health, addictions, trauma, mentorship, childhood development, parenting. It's all part of the same onion. And I've been really struck over the years about how much confluence there is in these approaches, but also how much diversity. When we're talking about addictions and working in the addictions community, people often stay within that community. I think that's partly due to the stigma around addictions and the sense of belonging and safety that the addictions community provides. But one of the consequences of that is that people often aren't aware of some of the stuff that's happening out there in the world around them because they don't kind of venture into those communities. So I wanted to give you today a little bit of sense of what's been happening out there so that at the end we've explored maybe 3 possibilities. One possibility is in helping you think about how you think in yourself about how addiction works. Or another possibility might be thinking about your work with clients. If you work with clients, what that looks like and the kinds of approaches you take. And the third thing is possibilities about building programs. We have a lot of addictions programming now, a lot of ideas about what that might look like, where it might go, what we might do, how to incorporate research into that process. So I want to give you a sense of where you might take that in your own work if building a program is something you do. I'm also going to say 3 potentially provocative things. If you like to keep up with research and you're interested in kind of the bleeding edge of things, these are not going to be provocations. These are going to be really obvious, duh, kind of things. But if you are very traditional and you are very focused on a particular approach, then some of what I say might be a little bit provocative. So I want to warn you in advance that that could happen. I could say something provocative. Okay, so the first set of things that I want to say is about complexity and normalcy. We've talked a lot today already in various conversations about research and about what people are discovering as they explore how approaches to addictions recovery and trauma recovery can work. One of the difficulties with that is that the human animal is so complex that it's very, very difficult to derive consistently reproducible results from research, especially from academic research. So what we see is a kind of large swath of stuff that's out there, some of which applies to our context and some of which does not. So as we go on today, I'm going to try to show you and share with you the research that I have found is consistent across different domains, and that has been shown to be one way to establish that a direction of research is useful in the long run for people. The second thing I want to do is talk about normalcy for just a second. If we're a representative demographic of Canadian society here, we've got a couple of hundred people in this room struggling with a mental illness. We've got maybe 100 people in active addiction of one kind or another, maybe more, because we're in the recovery world where a lot of people smoke. So that number might be more than 100. We've got a number of people dealing with significant trauma in their own personal lives. And even if you don't fall into one of those categories, you've got a family member or a loved one who's struggling with these kinds of things. So we're all part of this landscape of human frailty. And one of the aims that I have consistently tried to further in my own work is to normalize mental health challenges and to normalize trauma as a basic feature of the human condition. And so as I go on, I want you to think about clients and programs and addiction and policy, but also want you to think about your own life and the ways in which these kind of issues are direct and personal to you, whether or not you're a professional. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 things that we see in addiction specifically. The first is a behavior adaptation to pain. whether that pain is physical or emotional, is impossible to determine cleanly. There's never any distinction, any clear distinction between physical pain and emotional pain. It's part of a continuum of experience, and addiction is largely connected to this adaptation that people get because they're trying to flee pain. That should be really obvious and really straightforward. The second thing we see in addiction is dysregulated emotional imprinting. We see patterns of behavior that are emotional, that are not ruled or governed by the cognition, things that people do that are part of their behavior in a daily way that they don't control at all, and that are deep in the emotional reality of the body. I'll keep coming back to this a few times in this next hour. We have a tendency to be a very head-centered and brain-centered culture, and most of the useful and innovative approaches to things like trauma and addiction don't have a lot to do with our thinking. They have a lot to do with the body and what happens deeply in the body, especially our emotional life, which is way more powerful than anything we can do with our cognition. And the third thing we see in addiction is locked response patterns. We see this kind of instinctive, emotive action that keeps people in the same pattern over and over and over again. It's a locked pattern. People can't get out of it. They don't have any control over it. It's far beyond willpower. They're just stuck in it, and it runs them. And it's the body that's running them. It just keeps them moving along, and those locked response patterns sustain over years and years and years. So we see those three things, right? We see a behavioral adaptation, we see emotional dysregulation, and we see locked responses. That's typically the suite of behaviors and moments and experiences that we see in addictions and trauma as well. So that's the kind of snapshot of what normally is presented to us. And notice something about this. This is the first provocative thing I want to say. That addiction is not the primary problem here. We look at the end point. We look at addiction and using as the thing which is the core problem. And my argument, which is either obvious or provocative depending on your point of view, is that addiction is not the primary problem. It's what's underneath the addiction that's the primary problem. We'll get to what's underneath it in a moment, but we've tended to focus all of our efforts on the end of that train, the front leading turbulent edge of that train. When in reality, we don't see the whole train. The whole train has a bunch of things that have contributed to it. Trauma, mental health issues, developmental issues, childhood issues, community issues, poverty, cultural issues. All kinds of things go into this, and we only look at this endpoint. So I want to encourage you to think about that and how that might apply to your work. You may already think this way. And if you do, I think that's great. But if you don't, there's possibly an avenue there to move toward a way of thinking holistically about what this means, what we're doing about it. The second thing I want to say is to give you a little bit of overview of what happens in the world of research into healing in other domains. I'm going to choose 3 domains as examples of the kinds of things we could learn a bit from. The first area is chronic pain. Chronic pain has been exhaustively researched in a bunch of different ways over the last 25 years or so, and the results are really interesting. So many of our addicted clients have chronic pain. For many of them, their chronic pain is the beginning or was the beginning of their addiction. So chronic pain is pervasive in the addictions community. In the chronic pain world, what people have learned is that pain itself is a learned behavior. It's not only about biomechanical or biochemical issues that happen in the body that are determinative, that say, this happens in your body, this thing breaks in your body, and this is the level of pain that you feel. The chronic pain research has shown very conclusively that there's a complex and mysterious relationship between pain and awareness. And that so much of the pain that we experience is not about the biochemical or biomechanical aspects of the body. It's about how we interpret and teach ourselves to be in pain. This is a really challenging thing for people with chronic pain to get. that we teach ourselves to be in pain. First, the pain teaches us, and then we teach ourselves to continue the pattern that the pain has created for us. And addiction is just like this. We continue to teach ourselves to do the same thing over and over and over again, amplifying the condition indefinitely. The second area of interest, from my point of view, is with depression and anxiety, and you probably know all about this already. You probably know that the emotional content rules the behavior much more than cognition does. You've probably seen lots of research to show that people struggling with depression and anxiety are struggling with these dysregulated emotional patterns that just run them. It's like they're on a bus, and they're sitting at the back of the bus and somebody else is driving, especially with depression. Anxiety is a little different. You know, you get this free-flowing anxiety, this free-flowing energy with anxiety, and it's a little bit more manageable. But depression can feel like a completely powerless experience. The emotional content runs the body, runs the self, runs the whole thing forward. So what's happened in that world is that people have increasingly recognized that cognition and cognitive approaches are not sufficient. They can help. They can help to channel things a little bit. But the dysregulation of the emotions that happens with depression and anxiety cannot be, typically, fully healed just by thinking about it, or just by talking about it, or just getting some insight about it through counseling or other means. One of the interesting things for me as a counselor over the last 30 years has been the consistent shift in counseling slowly, incrementally, away from talking, and into many, many other domains that I'll talk about in a bit. Emotions rule behavior. The third piece that I want to pull on is from the world of trauma, and you probably know a lot about trauma. And many, many other speakers will or have been speaking about this. Trauma seems to be generally recognized now as one of the main underlying features of addiction, one of the causative features of addiction. So everybody is familiar with, knows about trauma. And the primary patterning we see with this is a dysregulated pattern locking. So the behavior of the nervous system is changed by the experience of trauma. And by the nervous system, I mean the brain and the body, and the whole system is tweaked, is stopped and reconfigured to work and persist toward preservation or continuance of these locked response patterns. Now, what's kind of interesting is you can match this all up together, right? You can look at the four core response patterns: flight, orient, freeze, and fight. And you can match them up. You can match them up to the mental health challenge, the type of addiction, substance addiction that people are likely to get as a result of that, and also the type of technology addiction. So, for example, trauma that imprints the fight response encourages people to keep fighting long after the trauma is done, because the fighting is the thing that allows them to survive the trauma. And it cultivates a kind of continuance of anger. And that's more likely to point you in the direction of alcohol than any of the other substances. And it's more likely to push you in the direction of gaming, violent gaming in particular, if technology is the thing you do to manage your behavior, manage your self-regulation. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this piece, but it is interesting to know that the four common types of addictions match up really nicely to the four common mental health challenges that people face, which in turn match up really nicely to the four kinds of substances that people use. So I like that. It's a nice little map. I put cannabis in the middle. It's in our cultural conversation right now a lot for a variety of reasons. What's interesting about cannabis is that it seems to work on all four branches of the nervous system. It brings all of them into artificial equilibrium. And that's why we see with cannabis users who are impacted in a negative way, we see this kind of disengagement and artificiality in their behavior, because they're artificially self-regulated in a way that is not about their own awareness or consciousness or mindfulness. They're just kind of artificially modulated. So trauma research has informed a tremendous amount of addictions treatment, potentially, right? So, those three things lead to this. Pain is learned, emotions rule, and responses lock. That's what we see in addictions. Pain is learned, emotions rule, responses lock. So that leads to the second provocation, which is that insight is not enough. Now, you probably know this already, right? I'm hoping this isn't too provocative. But if that's the case, if people genuinely recognize that insight is not enough, then why do we persist in focusing so much of our efforts in recovery on insight-focused activities? We do a lot of that. We do a lot of talking, sharing, sitting, being able to get some insight about what's going on in the inner life, what the history means, how to move forward in a cognitive way. And as I'll talk about a bit later, perhaps we spend just a little bit too much time on insight because the research doesn't really support it. What the research supports is that the kinds of changes we need to make in order to heal from addictions and trauma are deeper. They're deeper than what can be managed through thinking and talking. Thinking and talking can help in the short run to manage behavior in a daily way. You can talk yourself through a panic attack. It's tough, but you can do it. You can remind yourself to breathe. You can go slow. You can take a break and go stand in a corner and just talk to yourself. And you can do it. You can manage a panic attack through your cognition. But you can't fix your panic that way. You're going to have another panic attack. Fixing the panic attack is deeper, because the panic attack is a locked response pattern. Your body has decided this is what you need to do in order to get through the day. And it'll keep doing it. And you don't have any control over that. And people who experience authentic panic will tell you this. They have no control whatsoever over it. It's like this train just leaves the station and they're on this crazy, chaotic ride. So, it's deeper. It's deeper than insight. As a counselor, I have a tremendous affection for insight. Insight is great, and I will talk a bit later about where we might use it. But I think we should recognize when we're building and delivering programs for addictions and trauma that insight is only part of the equation, and we have maybe 80 or 90% of our services focused on, with individual clients and helping them heal, focused on getting some insight. And perhaps we should think about that balance a little bit. Two examples of this. One is smoking and the other is ice cream. It's lovely for me to see so many familiar faces here in the room. Colleagues, former colleagues, students, former students, people I've known for 20 years sometimes. And I'm really struck by the deep commitment that people show in this work and the fact that people stay in this work. Not for the money, of course. Yeah, I'm sorry, but if you're in it for the money, there was a mistake in career counseling somewhere. But one of the things that those of you who know me will be familiar with is that I rail against smoking. Even though it's been shown that if you quit smoking at the same time you quit everything else, your chances of recovering from everything are better. People keep smoking. They can't stop. And it's a real problem. And smoking is a great example of how insight's not enough. Everybody who smokes knows that it's probably going to kill you. It may not kill you immediately, but it's going to kill you eventually in a way that's really nasty. And you can't do anything with that insight. It doesn't alter your behavior. And you get stuck in it. People feel really bad about being stuck in this and really worried about the future. Some years ago, I was the clinical supervisor for the BC Cancer Agency's Stop Smoking Helpline. And they had counselors who manned the phones and would take calls from people all over BC trying to quit smoking, and they would have conversations with them about what's working, and what are you trying, and how are you feeling. And one of the things the counselors noticed was that there wasn't any particular correlation between method of approach to quitting and success in quitting. There was nothing that stood out, except that people quit when they were emotionally ready to quit. When somehow they had found another way of fulfilling that emotional need that the smoking provided in their daily lives. And when that happened, the smoking cessation, the quitting, was effortless. Wouldn't that be nice? Quitting smoking effortlessly. But that's what the counselors found again and again and again, was that many of the people who succeeded just got to this point where they were like, I'm done, and it's not a big deal. That is not about willpower. It's not about convincing yourself through the loss of your slide deck. It's not about convincing yourself cognitively that you can do it or applying personal skill. It's deeper than that. It's about deep shifts in the emotional life. So smoking is a great example of how insight's not enough. The other one is ice cream. If you're trying to lose weight, which most people in the world currently are trying to do, you know how it works. You can use self-regulation and self-discipline for a while. The people who research this, people who research self-regulation, they say you can do it for like 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, like you can go to the gym for 3 to 4 weeks, right? So you decide that you will not eat ice cream at night, period, and that will help you lose weight, which it will, probably. But you know, after 3 or 4 weeks, you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, you go down to the freezer, you pull out that pint of triple brownie overload ice cream, and you just scarf it right down. And while you're doing it, you are horrified at your behavior. Insight is not enough. The body takes over. The body has way more power than we do. Okay. So what does this all suggest, and what are people finding, and how might we use these kinds of things? So here are a few signposts from research. The first one is about cultivating self-awareness. Awareness particularly of our emotional life. And people talk about mindfulness in that context. But the way that I'm talking about it is not with regard to mindfulness meditation, where you sit and pay attention to your breathing or something similar to that. Those things are useful, but I'm actually not talking about that. What I've seen in other domains where I have had the privilege to work is that people use mindfulness as a way of describing a behavior that is usually focused on bodily movement, like playing a musical instrument, or woodworking, or working with objects in a museum. Those are all examples of other work that I've done. And what people find in that work is that there's a kind of mindfulness that's about bringing presence through the work of hands and the work of the body. Just being present to oneself, just being present to the experience. That's the kind of mindfulness I'm talking about, and that kind of mindfulness promotes self-awareness in a very deep and lasting kind of way. There's a tremendous amount of useful direction we might take from those fields about how to apply mindfulness. At the moment, in addictions recovery and trauma work, mindfulness tends to be focused very narrowly on the type of mindfulness meditation that we derive from Buddhism. And although, as I said, I do like that tradition, it's just one view of what mindfulness might be. The second thing is, in the world of emotional regulation, I feel sad that we live in a cold climate. One of the things that has been really rewarding for me is to work with programs that are focused on nature experience. In schools, in therapeutic communities, in adolescent treatment programs, in the US and in the UK and in Europe, my experience has been really rewarding in seeing the value of experiences in nature. There's something deeply, authentically, organically healing about being in nature. We don't do a lot of that. Not only because it's cold, but it's not filtered its way into the conversation about addictions and trauma here in Canada. I can tell you that it has elsewhere, especially in the United States, but not here. Here, people are inside in their recovery. Everything happens inside. And you might go for a little walk in the park once in a while, or you might have a little camping trip once a year that you do with your program, but the explicit focus on nature experience as an inherently healing activity has not really happened in our community. People are starting to talk about it, people are starting to think about it, and that I think is a wonderful step, but so far nothing programmatic really has been done with it. And that's interesting, because an avalanche worth of research lately, the last 10 or 20 years anyway, has shown that just the act of going outside into a municipal park, like not rock climbing the Squamish Chief, but going for a walk in a municipal park for 10 or 15 minutes has a dramatic effect on the nervous system. It has an inherently, organically stabilizing impact. That's really interesting. It's not a counseling approach. It's not a medical approach. It's not a policy approach. It's humans wandering the landscape, which is how we evolved over the last 6 million years. So we could do more of this. The research on this is really robust, really strong. And the third thing is about unlocking response patterns in trauma. You probably know, if you work in trauma, that insight is not enough and that people have to work with the body. And we see this in the depression research, where the most effective method of working with depression for many people is not medication, is not counseling, is actually exercise. Particularly running, which spontaneously stabilizes all 4 branches of the nervous system. That's why it works. It's a nervous system thing. It turns out that stressful exercise is the pathway toward retraining the nervous system. So I put stressful there with 2 examples, strength training and running. Running has made a small inroad in our local community. I know that a number of the programs that I've worked with have done things like, take a group of clients on the Sun Run, for example, which is great. So there's been a bit of running. Nothing has happened in our local community around strength training, as far as I know, with any program. But those 2 areas, there's a tremendous amount of very interesting research showing that if you want to retrain the nervous system, you have to stress it and teach it. So if we're trying to heal from trauma, and we want to teach the body how to be different, we need to put some stress that the body will adapt to. And the best 2 ways to do that are strength training and running. You can, after today, if you want, if you go on Google and you type in addictions recovery strength training or addictions recovery running, you'll find a whole raft of things out there. One of the great joys of my life has been my long-term involvement in the running community. And it's interesting, people in the running community who have addictions, they don't go to treatment. They don't go into programs. They have no interest in that. What they do is they run. And the running community is filled with people who are using running as a means of recovery. Just that. Now, if you're a professional counselor or a therapist, you might think that's irresponsible. But people in the recovery community, they see this as a kind of, a spiritual awakening of running as therapy. It works for them. It works extraordinarily well. So could we take some portion of that approach and integrate it into what we already do? Probably. So, mindfulness heals pain. The chronic pain research is really interesting in this way. Your pain is not about what's going on in the body, it's about what you've taught yourself to feel. I got my start in this business 30 years ago working in a chronic pain facility, and I've been ever since that time really interested in following the chronic pain research. The body teaches us, and then we teach the body. So mindfulness helps with that. Redirecting pain, touching into the emotion of pain, trying to modulate the pain through the body. Mindfulness helps with that. Nature heals emotions. More than a lot of other things you'd think that would help healing emotions, nature experience seems to be built in so that we automatically respond in an emotionally regulated way. You know how it goes. The old saying is just go for a walk. If you're upset, just go for a walk. Well, that's pretty deep wisdom, actually, because going for a walk makes a difference. Nature experience is an inherently trauma-containing kind of activity. And then training heals trauma. So by training, I mean all the things we normally do, like insight work and self-awareness and safety and all that kind of stuff, but also training the body. I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that in a bit. So the third provocation is this. We have been slow in the world of trauma and addictions recovery in BC. We've been actually quite slow in adopting some of these ideas. We've had other things to do. We've been busy, for sure. But we've also been quite insular. That's been my experience, and I'm sorry if that sounds provocative, but we've been quite insular. And we're trying now, many of us, to reach out and see what people are doing in other domains, as is happening at the conference here. We're hearing from people from Europe, and it's wonderful to hear these different perspectives. And so that openness is starting to happen. But for a long time, BC has been a quite insular place with regard to these kinds of ideas. It wasn't so long ago that the only acceptable subject of conversation in talking about recovery from addictions was the 12-step model. It wasn't that long ago that you really couldn't broach any other ideas. And that's moved forward. That's good. But we've been a bit slow in picking up some of the stuff that has been out there for a while, because none of what I'm sharing here is actually new research. It's been around for quite a bit, and for a variety of reasons, we maybe just haven't paid quite as much attention to it as we could. Okay, that's the last provocative thing. That was easy, right? Okay. So, if we were to move forward a little bit, if we were to think about where are we at and what could we do? Here are some thoughts about that. Here's something we do really well already. Tremendous amount of research has shown that belonging, trust, and safety are foundational to any health, growth, or educational process. The work that I do in corporations is largely focused on this. How do you cultivate belonging, trust, and safety for people? And in the corporate world, that can be a difficult challenge for sure. Same thing in education. But the sense of belonging, the sense of trust in others, and the sense of emotional safety with people is foundational to any initiative of growth and change. And I would argue that the recovery community in BC does that extraordinarily well. So this part is working. The second thing is, within the container, within the framework of belonging, trust, and safety, how could we cultivate those emotional dysregulation healing initiatives? How could we cultivate a way out of those locked response patterns? We would do that in part by self-regulation and self-awareness. Coming up with a good definition that separates those two things is really hard. But let me just say it this way. Self-regulation is about putting a gap between the spark and the flame of emotional awareness. Example. When you drove here this morning, if you drove, you probably had a moment where there was a car in front of you that was not driving appropriately in your point of view. And you had an emotional reaction to that. Probably rage and fury, spiking of the blood pressure. And what you thought, your impulse was to just be like Kathy Bates in Fried Green Tomatoes. That's an old person joke. And stamp the accelerator down and smash your car into the person in front, and it'd be very satisfying to do that. But you did not do that. You put a gap between the spark and the flame of emotional activation, and you just kept driving your car. You put a gap in there. And putting the gap is the key to self-regulation and self-awareness. We're always talking with people in addiction, in recovery, about how to prevent relapse. And largely our message to them is this. It's put a gap between the spark and the flame. Like when you notice that impulse to use arising within you, put a gap there that allows you to think about it, feel about it, and connect with other people so that you divert yourself before the impulse takes over. And the locked response pattern and the dysregulated emotions take over, and you lose that battle and you use. So we talk about this a little bit in the context of relapse prevention, but we don't teach people self-regulation and self-awareness, largely, in programs. We might do a small module on it here and there as a psychoeducational piece, but we don't really focus on this as a core piece, and we should. We should be teaching people that when they're in a residential program and they're helping to prepare a meal with the other clients, that how they do that is their recovery. It's not an aspect, it's not an obligation, it's not a responsibility, it is their recovery. How you peel the potatoes in the kitchen is your recovery. Because peeling the perfect potato is an aspect not only of mindfulness, but also self-regulation. Potatoes are annoying. Peeling it, there's always you peel it, and then there's like a little divot where it wasn't peeled. It's very annoying. Learning how to manage the potato is recovery. Okay, so we're not so good at that one, and we should get better. Mentorship and community, finding people we can connect with, clients can connect with, and help to develop a sense of belonging and trust and safety, as I said earlier. We do that really well. I'm always impressed by how much focus and dedication there is on these two things. And the community here is so strong, and my experience always is that clients who are authentically seeking help can find it, can find mentorship, and can be in a community. So the foundation is very, very strong, which is great. So that one works really well. This one we could work on a little bit, and this one works really well. So there are 2 out of the 3 that already are established and very robust, which is excellent. And then if we were to think about adding to those or supplementing them in some way, there are 3 keys to that. The first one is mindful skill. We spend a lot of time in recovery programs going to meetings where people talk. And I'm going to suggest that we replace or augment a lot of that with mindful skill development. I'll give you some examples of what that looks like in a bit. Nature experience is the second one that I've already said we should do more of because of the inherent power and rebalancing effect that nature offers. And then the third thing, which we don't do much of at all, is body-mind training. That stressful adaptation that the nervous system will yield in response to activities that we do that are explicitly focused on changing the nervous system. That is for trauma recovery and also relapse prevention. And that's what neuroplasticity is. Neuroplasticity is a fancy 5, how many syllables? Neuroplasticity, 6 syllables. Science. It's the fancy new term for how the body changes. What's interesting is that when we train the body, when we train the nervous system, we change not only our biomechanics, but also our biochemistry, plus our neurology, plus our genetics. We change the whole animal through training. Through bodily training and all the things I've been talking about, we change everything. A lot of people that I work with, when I do work with parents in schools, the most common anxiety that I hear from parents is that their child has a genetic predisposition towards something. And that therefore means that there's this thing that is there that is immutable. And it's a very delicate conversation at that point to help parents understand that that's not really the whole story. Genetic predispositions may or may not be a factor for some people. They appear to be a factor that accounts for as much as about 20% of significant issues, for example, schizophrenia. So genetic predisposition is a factor for sure. But that still leaves 80%. And one of the things that's interesting about body-mind training and neuroplasticity is that when you do that kind of work, you change the genetics in a very fundamental way. You change the whole person. And I think that's a very hopeful way to think about it. And that's what I try to share with parents in parent presentations, is that thinking about your child as being locked into a neurological disorder that will define their entire lives is quite problematic. even though it might be somewhat true. For example, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that's a pretty tough nut to crack. But using body-mind approaches and using the potentialities of neuroplasticity is one way to broaden that conversation and give people greater hope. The body is quite smart. You know, the brains of jazz musicians, for example, are different, structurally different, than the brains of people who are not jazz musicians. This does not mean that you are born with a jazz musician's brain or not. It means the act of playing jazz changes your brain. That's the side of that conversation we should focus on. The body-mind is smart. It adapts, but it only adapts to stress. And it only adapts to the right amount of stress. So what does that look like, practically speaking, if we were to, say, think about building a program in addictions recovery, which is the same as a program in trauma recovery, which is the same as a program in mental health recovery, since those two things are underneath the addiction. So here I have some practicalities that I'm going to suggest. They're not prescriptive in any way. They're just observations that I've made and things that I've heard and seen in my travels around as a consultant in a bunch of different areas. So they're just suggestions for possibilities. Okay, the first thing is get people to do more stuff. People are very sedentary in recovery. They sit around a lot because they're tired. Because they've been out on the streets for all this time and they're tired and they need to rest. Yeah, okay. I don't know, a day, 2 days maybe. And then people need to get out and they need to do stuff. And the way that some of my colleagues, the phrase that some of my colleagues use for this is training through play. We're not a very Canada, where play is not like our deal, right? We can do it if we're forced to. If it needs some learning outcomes that we're supposed to achieve, we can do it. But play is not really our deal. So we could be a little better at that, I think. And here's some examples of things that I've seen and worked with and done in programs that clients report often as being the most impactful thing. Training through play. One of the interesting things about neuroplasticity and nervous system adaptation is that you don't have to tell the nervous system what to do. It knows what to do. You have to get it into an environment where it can do its thing. And by way of evolution, that environment for humans is play. So whether that's playing at a playground like kids do, or whether that's playing a musical instrument like adults might do, or whether it's playing out in nature, the act of going, the act of allowing yourself to settle into an experience where the body can adapt to the environment stressfully is the pathway. Training through play. Teaching self-regulation and self-awareness. We do this a little bit, as I said, but it's something we could potentially do a bit more of because it's the key to the whole onion. Getting outside, as I think I've said like 25 times now. Resolving the locked imprints that come from trauma. How does that work? What does that look like? How could we do that? Here's how we do that. We look at the locked response patterns and we develop compensatory activities that resolve the unresolved imprints. This is pretty complicated actually, and it looks really simple when I show it on the one slide with cannabis in the middle. But it's actually straightforward. The body will know which response pattern is locked, and the body will resolve it through a broad range of mindful, engaged, natural, physical, stressful activities. That's what's so interesting about the wisdom of the body. The body is smart. So we don't have to be prescriptive. We don't have to say, if you are stuck in the freeze response because you're an opioid user, which is normal, typical, then we have to make you do yoga and put you in a support group and make you do community service. We don't have to do that. We need to get people out in the world, get them engaged in a multitude of ways. Cultivating empathy and trust, which we do really well already. Run, lift, play. Nice little mantra for nervous system training. Some people are interested in running, as I said, and we have a bit of that. We have no lifting as of yet. This is interesting. It turns out that so much of fitness research that comes out of academia is dead wrong. People who study research, there are such people, they study research. They have found consistently over the last decade or so that the majority of academic research is either not reproducible or not reliable. So it's hard to know what to believe. And of course you see this with fitness research. You see this with research that says, you should get 10,000 steps a day based on nothing. You get these kind of crazy things. And so we have this idea that aerobic activity is the be-all and the end-all for fitness and health, and it's not. It turns out that, especially as you age, the thing you should be focusing on more actually is lifting things, lifting heavy things and moving them around, which is how humans evolved, lifting rocks and carrying them, right? Not that I'm suggesting you create a program for addictions recovery where people lift up rocks and then move them. That is potentially a penitentiary kind of vibe. A little much, maybe. Okay. This one we do really well. Cultivating belonging and hope. I think that one is really robust already. And then the seeking of wonder and meaning. So there are two photographs here, one on top of the other. The photograph at the back is the girder, the corner of the first World Trade Center tower to be hit by the first plane. That's the steel right there, and that steel is suspended as the first exhibit in the September 11th National Memorial and Museum in New York City. I've been involved in a long-term project with them to study trauma healing from 9/11. And it's been an interesting, very purposeful kind of work for me to do over the last 4 or 5 years. The smaller photo is a firefighter that I worked with who had been there on the day, was one of these guys to go up the stairs when the buildings fell. And he had a crazy traumatic story about it. His job now is that he goes around the world and he helps people create 9/11 memorials. And the thing he's holding in his hand is a small polished piece of this steel girder. And part of his job is that he donates a piece of the 9/11 steel from the buildings to each of the memorials around the world. And he has managed to find for himself a very deeply purposeful, engaged path through the trauma by things like this. He's managed to find wisdom inside the wounding of it. And that's the great gift of trauma, and the great gift of addictions too. And that's the place we want to get to. We want to get to the place where we recognize that deep inside this wounding, there's a kind of authentic, organic, rich wisdom that we can use to carry ourselves forward and to build meaning and purpose and wonder into our lives. That's the boon, that's the treasure we get at the end. It's sad that so many people don't get there. They don't get to that place because they're not able to do some of the other steps I've been talking about. This guy's been working on this for 17 years, right? Doing this kind of deep, purposeful work. This is his trauma recovery. Going around working with groups of people, building and creating and constructing together, hefting big sheets of steel around and putting them up in these memorials. It's all that kind of work I've been talking about. And one of the things I've noticed in the museum work in particular, I've now done 5 of these. One at the 9/11 Museum, one at the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, one at the Derby Museum in the UK, another one in New York. And we find this consistently in the museum work, because museums are interested in trauma now, and how to help visitors with trauma. And they're creating these exhibitions where they try to immerse people in the historical experience of trauma, and they ask members of the general public just to walk on in, go experience the trauma. And that's why I have a new business, because there are traumatizing visitors all over the place. But that work has been very affirming for me, because it's from a different angle, but it reaffirms the same thing, which is that at the end of the day, addictions and trauma are deep teachers, and they have a kind of wisdom to share with us if we can get that far, and if we can open ourselves to that. Okay, we have a little time for discussion and questions, and during the period that we're doing that, I'm going to lose my slide deck. I need it back. Thank you. Here's the URL to the slide deck that I'm using here. It's public, it's open, you can log in. You can just go to that page and you can get all the slides. You can do it you can swipe with your finger and all that. And that's my email address if you want to follow up. But I thought I'd leave that up there because people don't write things down anymore. They don't know how to. They have to like take a picture and then it's fuzzy, and so I'll leave it up for a bit so you can check whether your photo works. Okay, time for questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. That was a great talk. So we've got a couple of questions here. One is, it sounds like what it all comes down to is connection to nature, body, community, spirituality, which many say is the opposite of addiction. Can you speak on this?
Well, you could see it that way, or you could see it that the connection to addiction is deeper than the connection to people. And that's what keeps the addiction going. So you can see it in those two different ways. But yeah, I mean, in a way it's about connection to self, connection to other people, connection to the body, and so on, as you've mentioned here. But I think we should recognize also that addiction is a connection. It's a deep, imprinted connection between the body, the nervous system, and the behavior and the substance. So that connection is deep and powerful. And many people will experience a deep kind of grieving when they stop using. They lose their friends, they lose their habits, they lose their rituals. Smokers. Crazy with smoking. Smokers, when they quit, they say things like, oh, I miss going out in the rain, outside with my umbrella, with my friends for my morning smoke. I miss that so much. You got to find a way to make that up because that's a connection. It's a deep connection. So yes, in some way it's all about connection. Okay, what else? What else we got?
Okay, the next one. So can you elaborate on what you mean when you say someone will change the genetics when implementing a body-mind approach?
Example. Let's say you want to test this. You could go to the gym and you could sit on an exercise bike and you could take a genetic profile of, say, one leg. You take a little test, you take a little biopsy, and you do a genetic profile of your leg muscle. And then you sit on the exercise bike and you exercise the leg muscle for a month. And you don't do anything else. You don't think about it. You don't feel it. You don't wonder what it all means. You don't do any counseling about it. You just move the leg, okay? And then after a month, you do a biopsy in the same place on the same leg and the same muscle. What you will find is that between 200 and 300 genes are different between the two samples. That's a pretty big impact. 1 month, one muscle, just doing one thing. So that's what I mean by changing the genetics. You are literally changing the gene expression in the body. You're changing what the genes do, the epigenetics.
Excellent. We are now going to close this session. It's time for a break. If anybody do you want more questions? All right. Okay. All right. The body knows what it wants. Okay. The next question on here is, can you become addicted to running?
Yeah, this is a really common question, and it's a useful one, and the answer is yes. Of course. We often find in recovery that people substitute one addiction for another. John Rady, the Harvard psychologist who's written a book about this called Wild, it's about this experience of switching psychotherapy for outdoor experience and running. He talks about this and says, you know what, if people do become addicted to running, it's a harm reduction method because running is less harmful than what they might have been doing previously. I don't exactly take that view. My view would be that that if we combine the act with mindfulness and self-awareness and self-regulation, as I've suggested. If we make it part of a suite of activities that people do, then we reduce the likelihood that that happens. We put a context and a container on it, which is much more helpful than just saying, go run, you'll be healed. Run across Canada, it will heal you. Not necessarily. It's not one thing. It's complex, like we said, and we need to think about all the factors that go into play. So I would say, yeah, there is some small danger that you can become addicted to running. I do see it once in a while, but it's not the norm, because running's hard. It hurts. Okay.
All right, this is our last question. One has to do with the definition of addiction. How do you define addiction? Do you reference the ASAM scientific definition?
No, I don't. Sorry. My definition of addiction is that it's an impulse for healing that is misdirected. The addictive impulse is an impulse for healing. It's an impulse to reduce pain. It's an impulse for peace. It's an impulse for relaxation. It's an impulse for confidence. It's an impulse for empowerment. And the substance temporarily delivers that experience for you. It does. It works. The medication works. You can be suffering terribly on the downtown east side in the middle of November when it's raining and it's cold, and you can take your opioid, and 5 minutes later you can feel like everything is okay. You're fine. You're good. It's crazy, but it works. So that impulse to use, that addictive impulse, is not a negative impulse. It's the impulse to find healing. And that pathway of healing is the only one that's available for that person in that moment. The trouble is that it's not a lasting kind of healing. It's a temporary kind of healing, and it keeps you coming back for more, and that's where the shadow side comes in. But I think of addiction as an urge for healing that is thwarted by circumstance.
Thank you very much.